Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Debate Simplified. This is episode number 5 on the Policy Debate YouTube channel. Today, I will be going in the direction of the negative. I've been giving lots of talks about things for the affirmative and some affirmative slanted lectures. So let's talk about some negative positions now with the capitalism critique. Debate Simplified is our series where I attempt to simplify concepts using pragmatic examples and things that you should be thinking about in the round itself. Um, my name is Jack Young. I am a debater at the Barclay Forum at Emory University, former debater at Montgomery Bell Academy, now working with and coaching Montgomery Bell. If you like what we're doing at the Policy Debate Central YouTube channel, please like and subscribe. All of our content is free and open sourced, so any support is appreciated. In terms of watch time, over 60% of people per hour are not subscribed to the channel. So, hit subscribe. We want to be able to have live chat for our future streams for the NDT and the TOC, so people can talk about what's happening in the round. We need a certain number of subscribers to reach that point. So any support would be greatly appreciated. All this information is open sourced and try to be made in educational content and form. We're all volunteers here, so that'd be greatly appreciated. And if you have any comments or suggestions for future episodes, please let me know in the comments section. All right, so brief note about this lecture is that it will be somewhat introductory and pragmatic. So I'm going to be focused on some of the ideas that you should be thinking about when wanting to both learn and then execute the CAPK on your first try of executing the CAPK. So it's aimed at the beginner intermediate level. And I'm just giving you arguments to think about, especially because, my version of what I think the CAPK should look like might be different than your version of the CAPK. Because as I'll detail later, the CAPK is a very dynamic position, a very big position that you can customize in any particular sort of way. Also, this is the CAPK versus policy affirmatives. I might give a lecture on the CAPK versus non-policy affirmatives later on, but that's a whole different can of worms and some different sort of concepts. So I'm not going to get into that in the future. So in order to critique capitalism, we have to understand what capitalism is. Capitalism is a way of organizing the economy where businesses, land, and resources are owned by individuals and not the government. This is the understanding of private production and private ownership, right? So these are owned by individuals or private people and enterprises that are not accessible to everybody else. The logic of capitalism is the logic of competition and market competition. So when companies compete with each other and sell products, that process leads to an innovation and leads to a decreased price for all people because people are self-interested, so they'll purchase goods at the lowest possible price. And companies will attempt to produce goods at the lowest possible price to maximize profitability. When affirmatives use markets or private property, they're using capitalism potentially remedy some of the issues with the status quo. Sometimes capitalism is described as neoliberalism, which is the modern view of capitalism. So, this is a description of capitalism that understands that capitalism has some regulation. However, the logic of production and self interest still dominates our current economic way of thinking. So, for the purposes of this lecture, the neolib K and the cap K are quite similar. And, for the purposes of what's going on, they're basically going to be described as the same argument. Maybe neoliberalism and capitalism describe somewhat different concepts, but in actual practice and debate, they're actually quite similar. So, what's the very brief history of capitalism? Well, the world was not always capitalist. In the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, we saw the evolution of capitalism with this guy named Adam Smith, who was a British or Welsh, I think, economist who viewed the process of free market competition as the best way to orient society and resources. He coined the idea of the invisible hand, which is the idea that because everyone is self-interested and competitive, and corporations want to decrease profits and consumers want to decrease prices, that the market will inevitably result in the best possible allocation of resources and prices because of this sort of self interest. So the market is a signaling apparatus of society, right? It signals and orients resources and goods in a particular sort of way because of competition. And capitalism relies upon, in some regards, the absence of external regulation in order to operate, right? Because capitalism fundamentally understands the economy as a mechanism, as a means for competition amongst entrepreneurs and consumers. So, whenever any regulation is introduced, such as a tax on those goods, then the competitive process of capitalism becomes less pure, right? So, capitalism is a pessimistic reading of human nature, right? So, I think we're all sort of familiar with this idea that we're all competitive and want the most money. And if we make a company, we will do everything we can to maximize the money that we make. And as consumers, we will make good choices and reward good companies that price goods properly. So that's very briefly what capitalism is, right? Private property, competition, etc. What are some examples of affirmatives that use capitalism and interact with capitalism? Like, what do these interactions look like? In terms of the high school topic, intellectual property is a capitalist idea, right? But instead of owning land or lemons for a lemonade stand, it treats ideas, you know, intellectual intellectual thoughts, right? Like, patents, different ways of making a particular good as basically a form of property, right? In the same way that you have private land or that you have private, industry, you will have a private factory that you own. Um, Ideas are entitled to protection, right? So that is a way in which capitalism has even used, intellectual ideas to as part of the sort of the private marketplace, right? Using the markets is obviously a capitalist idea because markets are capitalist now, and the idea of the market is basically the idea of capitalism. Oftentimes, international law is an attempt to protect property or secure certain types of resources for certain types of people, and we'll get into how that actually works in practice. And sometimes, American hegemony is also seen as a way in which America is attempting to protect its market, maximize how many resources it gets as a country, etc. So, why is capitalism worthy of criticism? One of capitalism's largest flaws is that of an externality. So, as I detailed very previously, the logic of capitalism is that companies and consumers will eventually find a price that works for both of them, right? And consumers will try to decrease that price, and corporations will try to increase that price. So, when you're selling a lemon at a lemonade stand, you would, as a consumer who is purchasing lemonade, you would like the cost of that lemonade to be as low as possible. And a corporation, because they want to make as much money as possible, will try to increase that price. And eventually, there is a sense of equilibrium where both parties are fine with what the price is, right? So the corporation still gets money, the consumer still gets their product at a fair enough price. But not every benefit or harm to society is determined solely by the economic cost of a good. So, for example, if I was producing, textiles, or if I was producing energy, right? If my company was polluting and pollution makes the world a worse place, it, harms the health of various people. That is not factored in the cost benefit analysis of the corporation who is selling the energy and the consumer who's buying the energy, right? Because that is solely determined by price. It is not determined by how actually beneficial that energy production is for society, right? So this is an externality. It is a benefit or harm to society that is outside the determination of the cost of goods. So pollution is a negative externality. A negative externality is an externality that is bad or problematic for society, and positive externality is an externality that is good for society. Um, because corporations do not pay for pollution under capitalism, because capitalism is solely focused on the economic rationale and interaction between consumer and producer. So externalities then problematize the logic of capitalism because the invisible hand, that idea that there's eventually some sort of equilibrium within capitalism, cannot control the external factors, the external externalities without a form of regulation, capitalism. So the problem of externalities is how capitalism may cause something like climate change, right? Because fossil fuels decrease the cost of producing goods. So under capitalism, that's great for everybody, particularly for consumers who want the price of energy to be as low as possible. But they're also inadvertently paying for the destruction of the planet. Or could also cause war because maybe a corporation or a particular country wants to maybe get access to a particular sort of resource in order to produce goods at a lowest possible cost and make as much money. And maybe that causes, maybe that's in another country, or maybe various countries are fighting over various trade disputes, and maybe that is a way in which capitalism can cause the negative externality of international instability. And because capitalism sort of relies upon the absence of regulation, at least in some part, these negative social consequences are, at least in some regard, inevitable to capitalism. These externalities also might render capitalism unsustainable. The argument of unsustainability is that capitalism cannot continue to sustain the logic of its own production due to its flaws, right? So capitalism relies upon the idea that it will be able to continuously grow, it will be able to continuously advance and innovate. But if there is are other externalities, right, like climate change, for example, then capitalism cannot continue to produce. It cannot continue to expand, and that means that capitalism is a process that is unsustainable. It cannot continue forever. So I talked about the equilibrium price, right, and I gave the example of the lemonade stand. So the equilibrium price would be the price in which the consumers and the producers under capitalism have agreed to the particular cost. Because, for a corporation, in the most ideal world, of course, it'd be awesome to price lemonade at something like $10,000, but no one's going to buy the lemonade at $10,000. So corporations understand that, consumers' demand is predicated on the price being something that's acceptable to them. So if the most amount of people are buying the lemonade at $2 and the corporation's still making a profit off of that lemonade, then that actually might be the most ideal profit maximizing price. And that's the equilibrium price. Um, an externality problematizes the equilibrium price because the price is not reflective of the benefit to the act production to society. So this is also described. An externality is described as the social cost of production. So it's the cost upon society for production and consumption of that particular good. And externalities are not factored in that analysis alone without an external regulation, like a tax on pollution, for example. Additionally, capitalism has produced tremendous wealth inequality, which critics view as a natural consequence of capitalism because capitalism by nature picks winners and losers, and without regulation, these winners keep winning and these losers keep losing. So suppose that you want to create a business that competed with Jeff Bezos. Well, Jeff Bezos has billions of dollars, way more capital than you, so he can outcompete you using ideas like economies of scale, where the more you're producing, the cheaper the total production is, right? If you have a bunch of factories, and you can decrease that cost. You have basically nothing, so he'll probably always win. And this also often, sort of from a sociological perspective, oftentimes occurs alongside racism or other forms of exploitation like colonialism, because certain groups have less access to resources. They'll never be able to outcompete because it's fundamentally unfair. Um, this is also the understanding of capitalist imperialism, which says that states are competing for resources in the global south, and that the global south doesn't really have a say in the actual distribution of those resources, right? So this is the idea that the global south is a periphery of the global north, or the Europeans, Americans, and maybe China, Japan, South Korea, places like that, right? Because these countries all rely upon the resources of the global south in South America and Africa, for example, and they violently and oftentimes exploitatively take those resources at a very cheap price produce a good in their own particular country and then sell that final good back to the global south at a higher price, which creates an unfair exchange of goods and services. This wealth inequality also creates a class system, which is fundamental to the critique of capitalism, where those who control the means of production, the bosses and executives, have far more power than those who actually do the labor themselves, the workers. This is the distinction between the proletariat, who are the workers, and the bourgeoisie, the bosses, those who owns the mean of production, right? So everyone that owns the way in which the good is produced will always invariably have more power, more access to resources, more access to money than the final, than the actual people laboring that are doing that work. Um, and that creates it's basically a binary in society, right? A critic of capitalism will say that capitalism is sort of the determinative mode of society, right? Is the most influential aspect of society. It grounds material relationships, right? Like how much money I have, how much money you have is very descriptive of a potential life we can or cannot live. And the fact that there's an essential distinction between proletariat and bourgeoisie creates a fundamental inequality in that society. So, even though capitalism does indeed produce a tremendous amount of wealth, where this wealth actually gets distributed is a problem, right? Like, if a, there's a total amount of wealth that's actually quite high, well, if only a particular small segment of society owns all this wealth, that seems like a problem. I have assembled some images for y'all to look at. This is the distribution of household wealth by U.S. income group. So you can see that the bottom 50% is just this very tiny sliver of who's actually owning wealth in the United States. And then you get this sort of middle, maybe call this the upper middle class, then you call this the upper class, and the top 1%. And the top 0.1% owns more of this chunk of income than it's almost like double, maybe triple of this bottom 50%, which seems like an inequality that is very problematic. And you can see that this is actually increasing, right? So, like, the top 1% is gaining a large, confluence of wealth. The bottom 50%, as you can see, is very, very hard to see. It's sort of stagnating, even though things have, statistically gotten better. Here we can see the distribution of wealth in a pie chart. So this is from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Says that these 13.2 million families owned the vast majority of the wealth. Then the sort of upper middle class portion owned like about a quarter, and then 65 million, like half of the United States is only owning 2% of that total wealth, right? And that seems quite problematic. You can see is all of these people versus in a very densely packed area versus all of these people, right, who are owning the most total amount of wealth. Finally, in the United States, there's a white black wealth gap, which is also described by the Federal Reserve in St. Louis. You can see here that the this demonstrates the 75th percentile of wealth for Black Americans, Black families, right? And it's even lower than the median wealth for white families. And then the bottom, then this is also the median for Black families as well. So you can see that the nature of capitalism might be producing some forms of inequality. Finally, capitalism might have negative personal and social consequences. So, for example, alienation, which is an idea that says that as people are working for like a wage, they become alienated from their labor. They become their life is sort of constrained by this relationship between doing this task and getting a wage, which makes the actual process of laboring bad. And we could also say that the capitalism's pessimistic account of human nature, that the idea that I talked about, that we're only rational, competitive, self-interested, might justify bad things, might just be a bad way of approaching the world. So we could say here that capitalism is a way of thinking about the world, right? It is an ideology that brackets out alternative ways of thinking. And when I get to framework, you should keep this in mind, right? So lots of philosophers have criticized capitalism through the lens of epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and culture, and also on the level of ideology. Like, what is it telling citizens, and how do we think? And the way in which we're thinking is actually constrained by capitalism. Um, Very finally, I'll talk about Marx real quick, who is one of the original OG Cap K 2N. He viewed capitalism as an unsustainable evolution from mercantilism and feudalism. He thought that capitalism was actually better than these two systems, but thought that the world was progressing towards socialism, which is collective ownership of the means of production, and that this socialism would eventually lead to communism, which is a stateless and classless society. The Marxist belief was highly influential throughout the 19th to 20th centuries and led to the Russian Revolution as well as countless other revolutions. If you're interested in thinking about capitalism from a critical perspective, here are some books, websites to read, and a couple videos to check out. Um, all these books are everything here is very simple and oriented towards a more general audience, not as much as a philosophical audience. So, take a look at those and see what you might like. All right, so I talked a lot about capitalism. So let's talk about capitalism in debate. Because capitalism has so many disadvantages, it's natural that it's become probably one of the most, if not the most popular debate argument of all time. Um, it is a K, so let's take a step back and it is a K. So what do you have to do to win the debate? Like, what are the steps? What's the checklist in order to win the debate? First, you need to prove that the affirmative is capitalist. This is the link. Second, you need to prove that this type of investment in ideology is a valid grounds for contesting the affirmative, which is framework. Third, is you need to provide reasons why capitalism is bad, obviously, which is the impact and sustainability portion. And then you need to provide an alternative that solves the impacts, which is the alternative. So let's think about the CapK strengths and what you would want to do in the 2NR, right? The CapK is very strong. First, it is very easy to get links on many affirmatives because socialists write about a lot of issues, quite a lot. Lots of blogs. The Jacobin website has basically linked to every affirmative that's ever been read, for example. So, it's basically a customizable strategy. Second is that it's fairly easy to prove the impacts of capitalism and requires lots of 2AC and 1 year time investment. This is because you're going to be reading lots of cards. I'll talk about some ideas on the impact for the 2NC. So you're going to be reading lots of cards, and you're going to be saying lots of things on every section of the CapK, every portion of the checklist, which actually makes it a very, very difficult 1 ER to give, especially if there's other arguments in the block. Third is that it's customizable, has different iterations, and is a generic that can fit into many types of blocks. So one of my recommended and favorite easy to execute blocks is the Cap 2NC Process 1R block, which requires lots of 1 ER arguments, spending time on lots of issues. And because there's lots of tricks on both cap and process in terms of framework, permutation, impact, sustainability, as well as counterpoint competition, um, the 1 ER is actually it's a very hard speech to give, especially in high school where it's only 5 minutes. And this block can also be read against new affirmatives or affirmatives that you don't have a case neg to. So if you get very good at this strategy, lots of debaters, lots of some of the best high school debaters I've interacted with have gotten good at going for this particular strategy. And I went for the strategy all the time in high school. And if you have a different, sort of style of going for the CapK than me, that's just fine. But I'm giving sort of how I understand the CapK and how I think to conceptualize the CapK. But again, because capitalism is such a large facet of society, there's obviously lots of different grounds of criticism. Lastly, it's very simple, and most people, even policy judges, understand capitalism, its critics, and are going to be more willing to vote for the cap K as opposed to another iteration of a K that they might think is more generic, more focused on the fiat K, for example. So, given these strengths, what should the ideal 2NR look like? The best iteration of the cap K 2NR is impact focused, right? So, you want to prioritize your strengths of the position in the 2NR, and perhaps the best strength or one of the best strengths of the cap K is the diverse set of impacts that you're going to be arguing. So you should be winning these impacts, right? This includes both the impact portion proper and sustainability, which we'll talk about both. Second is that you should be able to prove to the judge that they should reject the permutation. The permutation is likely the lose condition for you in most debates in the 2AR. So we'll talk about more ways about thinking and rejecting the permutation. Third is that you should be able to negate the cap case weaknesses, which are mainly the permutation and the alt fails. And we'll talk about how to get over all those. Because the cap K is a large position, you need to be able to understand all the varieties of types of 2ARs to the cap K. Because it can be argued for and against in a variety of ways. I think that the reason in which I talked lots about capitalism and trying to understand capitalism is because a lot of the times, especially in K debates, right, like you need to be at least somewhat familiar with the literature on all different sides in order to understand all the potential 2AR responses and what you want to say in the 2AR against every type of 2AR. So if you want any advice, and if you don't know maybe what the potential types of 2ARs are, I recommend you go back to episode 3 where I talked about framework, but I also demonstrated all of the potential F responses to Ks in general. And there's basically a chart that demonstrates all the potential things. And you want to have a 2AR strategy to all those. And I'll help you with some of that. But because the cap K is large, it's also the reason why the cap K is such a good argument, right? Because you're defending a controversial position that has ground on both sides, so there's not a lot of fairness loss on framework, with highly customizable link and impact arguments. You can break new impacts, you can break new links, you can break new turns case arguments, all that sort of stuff. So the best thing about the cap K is that at one tournament you can say these 4 impacts, and then the next tournament you can say 5 through 8 impacts, right? You can say a variety of different things if you're keeping up with research, because it is basically a canvas upon which you can say a variety of different arguments. So, 1NC construction of the cap K. The most typical view of the 1NC, the most like common way it's read, is a link card, impact card, and alt card, and I think that this is typically the best. So the link card can be generic or specific. Obviously, it's preferred if you have a specific link card, but if you don't, that's okay. An impact card, a good cap K impact card in the 1NC will have a variety of warrants. So it'll sort of describe like a polycrisis of capitalism, right? It'll say climate change, war, AI, all sorts of things. It'll have a variety of warrants. You highlight all those warrants, and then in the 2NC you can blow this up, right? And an alt card, which can be generic or specific to the affirmative. Again, specific is desirable, but not always the case. And on specific topics, the alternative might need to look a little differently if you want to have better arguments against permutation. So, for example, on the high school IPR topic, one iteration of the CAPK is to abolish IPR, which is naturally better at demonstrating mutual exclusivity than a generic revolution alternative, because it's basically sort of kind of a counter plan, right? It does the opposite of the plan, so it is more clearly mutually exclusive than maybe a bigger CAPK alternative. All right, let's talk about the impact of the cap K. As I said, the 1NC impact is typically large, and this basically allows you to blow up any one warrant in the 2NC, which outpaces the 1AR. Right, so there's a variety of impact categories. There's environmental impacts, climate change, pollution, peak X, so peak phosphorus, peak gas, peak whatever. All these are due to the externalities of capitalism that we described. Second are the structural impacts, which I also describe: inequality, poverty. You can make this soft-left. You can also say extinction. That's fine. You can also say inequality, poverty turns case. Third is something like war, which is a result of both the structural and environmental impacts, like externalities, etc. I kind of described how capitalism can or cannot cause war. You might want to criticize militarism, the U.S., for example, NATO. And lastly, is some sort of emerging technology. Because capitalism is very good at innovating, right? You might say, hey, this innovation's bad, right? Like capitalism is making these AI systems because people think that AI is going to be highly profitable, and we're actually not developing with enough regulation. And now all these AI systems can potentially cause all of us to face a tremendous amount of suffering, right? So that's one example in which there's a new technology. That's an iteration of an impact that you can say. The 2NC should try to have most of these alive, continuing in the 2NC, especially if the choice is the impact turn, right? So you should probably have about 3, at least 3, but hopefully more than that, like 5 to 6 impacts to the CAPK low key, because you want the 1AR to drop one of them, or you want the 1AR to just be like, we're going to lose the impact, we have to go for framework, right? Because then you get to your framework wheelhouse. And if the 2AC impact turns capitalism, then you should attempt to have impacts on those impact turns too. So, for example, if the 2AC says capitalism is key to space colonization, then you should just say that space colonization is bad. Or if the 2AC says capitalism is key to prevent war, then you should say no, capitalism causes war, for example. And that can be a kind of quasi defensive response that's actually ingrained in your offensive strategy. And again, proliferates more things the winner should answer, right? So when you're constructing everything on the cap game, the 2NC, you need to be like, word efficiency, what things do the one year have to answer? And how much time investments does the one year have to answer with, right? Like if the one year does not say a piece of impact defense or one of your impacts, you should be ready to let loose on that impact on the 2 right? And eventually you'll have so many arguments on everything if you're maximizing efficiency and technicality on the cap K because there's so much to say on your side that the 1AR is in a basically untenable position, especially if you're saying process counterplan 2 and the 1R, or maybe another form of impact turn. So that another impact turn, maybe topicality. Any negative position really is customizable with the cap K, except the econ DA and the 1R, right? So you want to think about, of course, the 2NC is going to be quite large, obviously. I want you to read as many cards as possible. However, if you're highlighting correctly, right, go back to episode 4 or whatever 3 it was. I don't even remember at this point. Card aesthetics, you're highlighting. Like you have nice cards are highlighted, decently okay. There's a little bit of leeway, right? And you're making all these arguments. This is the basic strategy of the cap game. It's just flood the zone and see what the winner has to do, right? So if you can think about any potential way, like the idea of the 2NC, like the framework, the mindset you should have is how can I make the 1AR's life a living hell, right? And make them make mistakes. And then the 2NR blows up those mistakes. And suddenly the AF team's crashing out. 2A's like, why didn't you answer the 13th sub point on the impact? They're like, I ran out of time. I had to answer the unclobbered fells. So that should be the mindset in which you're approaching the impact level. The 2NC should also make turns case arguments on the link, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But these are also hidden impacts that the winner often handles, right? So on the IPR topic, you could say that capitalist IPR fails because it doesn't promote innovation because it's unevenly distributed, big pharma, whatever. I'm not exactly in tune with the IPR meta, but that's sort of a description you could go for. You can actually include some of your like IPR bad cards on the link, for example, to have even more offense. And the more specific these link turns case arguments are, obviously the better, right? Because if they implicate AF solvency, then the 2NC does not have to go to the case proper to be making case arguments, right? Because the 1ER will obviously invariably say that, they didn't answer case. Then you look at the judge and you're like, you give them a little look, you're like, yeah, we answered case. We said that we answered case on the links, right? So that's a way in which you can think about, offering the cap K again, and making the 1AR's life even harder, right? Because if you have link turns case arguments, then you also, that's another thing the 1AR has to answer. And then the list becomes just so large that the 1AR is in a very difficult position. This will also help you with the alternative, right? Because they might have AF-specific arguments on the alt fails that obviously cannot describe to you maybe how the alt solves a particular affirmative in the round you might have. But if you win that the AF also fails under that same logic, then hey, no one solves anything. Capitalism's bad, so just vote for us. So that's a way in which you can think about things. And if you're debating an AF that relies upon the market, then you should read, AF specific cards potentially that says that price signaling fails, right? So like a carbon tax is an attempt to tax the externality of capitalism. You can say that no, the market's actually not that great at innovating in allocating resources, and a carbon tax fails, right? And that's a way in which you can think about the cap K. Again, reminder that I'm spending lots of time talking about the impact because the impact is the best part of the cap K, right? Is your win condition in most debates. So you want to be thinking about how do I make my win condition so tight, like so hard for the winner to answer that there's no win condition for them after the block. AF responses to the impact are usually quite bad because you can always produce some new impact to capitalism from some random socialist online, and not many authors are answering them. And, I would always take the 2NR that's like, hey, you didn't read a card on this. We read a card on this. You said like 10 seconds of random high schoolers' thoughts on this issue. We have some random sociologist from the University of Sussex or whatever that says the opposite. So like you're 0, I'm 100, I win the debate, right? I would always take that 2 NR versus 2 AR. I would always vote neg. So again, that's a pretty good place to be. Usually the AF will attempt to solve, like say AF solves X particular impact. One is that obviously you should construct your impacts as external as possible, from what the AF potentially does or does not solve. And so, for example, the AF says that they solve climate change. A good time investment would be to talk about more about the war, the inequality, the AI related stuff, and talk about climate change. And then on linked terms case, you can say capitalism causes warming, it's unsustainable, causes warming, etc. Right? So that's, um, you know, again, focus on what's external, what's hard for the winner to answer. Saying F solves is an easy answer, so you want to make the winner lives as impossible as possible by making it as external as possible. If the app relies on the market or economy to solve, then you should obviously be in a good place because you are making linked terms case arguments that say that the market and the economy do not actually allocate resources efficiently. AF teams will more commonly impact turn capitalism than be defensive on capitalism. So I've outlined a few arguments: space call good, growth good, interdependence good, and CCS good. Here's your basic toolkit, right? A is sustainability, which I'll talk about very quickly in the next portion. B is the alt solves, right? So for example, you could say that if they impact turn growth, you could say the alt doesn't stop growth, but it does economics from a planned economy. Or you could just use fiat to solve lots of these issues, right? Third is impact or link turn. So you can say, if they say, for example, interdependence, which says that capitalism solves war, you could say, no, capitalism causes a war. Here's 3 cards, more things for you to answer, right? You can't always choose all 3 responses in the 2 and C. So, for example, you can't say that space call is bad and not the alt solves, which is a double turn. So you should be a little bit more tricky, right? You should say that capitalist space call is bad, capitalist AI is bad, capitalist growth is bad, but not socialist AI, socialist space call, socialist whatever, right? So that is a way in which you think about impact turning, right? So like, because the CapK is giving you so many impacts or so many authors, you can find a capitalism AI bad card like out of thin air. You can find a capitalistic growth bad card out of thin air, capitalist space call, all that stuff, right? As opposed to just generically impact turning. So like, I would not typically read like all of my generic space call bad cards, even if I thought I could win the debate just on that. Like, if I thought they didn't have space call good sauce, I would throw it in. But if you're at a more of a nuanced approach, then you can say everything. You can say no link. You can say capitalist space call bad. You can say all those things. So it requires a little bit more nuance, a little bit more trickery. So here's some of the things I would say against each particular 2AC type of impact turn. So space call good. First, the alt solves, no link. The USSR won the space race. Also, like, I don't know, the alt imagines a world in which socialists can go to the moon for good positive purposes, as opposed to like space tourism and Jeff Bezos doing space stuff. That's what I would say. Second, or is that you could just say space call's bad. Again, you can't choose both, so but you could say capitalist space call bad, for example. Second is growth good. First, obviously, spend lots of time on sustainability, and I'll talk about it in a second. Second is that the alternative solves reasons why growth is good, right? You could say that the alternative does indeed grow, for example. Um, but again, don't double turn yourself. If you want to say sustainability, say sustainability. If you want to read impact defense and sustainability, you do that. Or if you want to say the alt solves, you have to do that. That's combo force binary, less ability to be nuanced. And if you're impact turning growth, then obviously that debate becomes very similar to a DDEV debate, right? A debate about whether or not economic growth is good or bad. So, if you want to have that debate, have that debate. Again, that requires lots of card investment, lots of research. But the good thing is that if you are not on a big team or whatever, lots of that research has already been done for you on the wiki. So you just get that, you reformat it, and then you're in a good spot. CCS good. One, CCS is bad. Lots of reasons why CCS is actually bad. CCS is carbon capture and storage. So it is a emergent technology that attempts to capture carbon out of the atmosphere. Pro-capitalist proponents will say that capitalism is key to this. Like, we need to continuously innovate CCS in order to get it to a particular spot that is able to capture carbon out of the air. So that's briefly what carbon capture is. It's applied to like factory plants. So like a fossil fuel plant, you just put the CCS thing where the pollution is emitting from, and then you capture the carbon and then you store it in the ground. Okay. So one is that CCS is like bad. Like it's definitively bad. It's definitively not a thing that works. Check out Emory GY24 wiki. You'd be surprised on the quality of evidence on that question. Second is that the alt sols, again, on Emory GY24 wiki, that'd be Neg versus Western Kentucky round 4 of the Wake Forest tournament. And you got lots of CCS stuff there. Finally is interdependence. So the idea of interdependence is that because countries' economies are intertwined with each other, like, the US imports from China, exports to China, that these countries don't want to go to war because of interdependence. So interdependence solves war. First is that you can just impact defense interdependence, which is probably what I would do, right? It's not a real thing, doesn't actually solve every conflict. Conflicts are not, purely motivated by this logical economic analysis. Seems pretty true to me. Second is sustainability, again. Third is that capitalism causes war via the war chest, imperialism, stuff like that. All these big corporations want to make up a lot of military technology that actually makes us go to war. And that's like one way in which capitalism is becoming more and more profitable. And that actually creates an incentive to go to war. So that's the idea of the war chest. All right, let's talk about sustainability now. Because of the externalities and inequalities that capitalism produces, critics of capitalism will often say that it's unsustainable, so that it cannot go on infinitely. This is also sometimes described as a contradiction within capitalism. You should use sustainability as a way of arguing against the impact turn. Even if capitalism in principle might be a good idea, it cannot go on forever. If they're not impact turning than 2AC, I would spend less time on sustainability, not read that many cards on sustainability. Lots of times, one of the biggest errors in the 2NR is spending lots of time on sustainability when it doesn't really matter. Recognize if it does or does not matter, and then if they're impact turning the 1ER, that's probably what they're going to go for. Then obviously the 2NR needs to spend time on why capitalism is unsustainable, which is one of the better arguments answering the impact turn. So you need to be ready to say that if they're going to be impact turning. But it is basically fundamentally a defensive argument, right? Because it does not necessarily say that capitalism is bad. It says that it cannot go on forever, which is why you want to spend more time on impacts, because you want as much offense as possible. This also helps with potential link turns case arguments for specific impacts. So that if you say that capitalism is unsustainable and inevitably causes US-China war or warming, then the 1ER has to answer another argument, as I detailed. So here's some common sustainability warrants. First is warming growth in peak X, which I described on the impact section. The idea here is that the planet has finite resources. Growth requires the continuous exploitation of these resources, and that can go on forever. Second sustainability warrant is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, the TRPF, which says that it's a more complicated argument. So don't worry if this is, if you don't understand the first explanation of this, which is that capitalists invest in machines to boost efficiency, so like technological gains, innovation, etc. But profits actually come from workers, right? So like workers are the people who are buying um, workers are the ones who are buying like the goods that are being produced by machines, right? So like the analogy here is like, for example, if AI takes over all of our jobs, well then who's buying the goods, right? Because we don't have wages anymore. So because profits come from workers, the decreasing the like total wages of workers via technological innovation and the over reliance on innovation actually reduces the overall profitability of a system, which is like a common AI slash TRPF argument that says that means that capitalism is unsustainable. Third is that concept of stranded assets, which argues that capitalists have trillions of dollars in dirty investments like oil wells that will become irrelevant if we are to solve global warming. And we have so much of the global economy in this like dirty system, which is the reason we're not like going past it right now. It's the reason that we're staying in the status quo of like global warming and stuff, because it's so profitable, and going against it would be so unprofitable that we either can solve warming or we can collapse the entire economy, right? And it's a forced choice. Finally is the idea of a bubble. Bubbles burst. A bubble is a description of a particular industry or market that is overinflated. So like there's a ton of overinvestment in one particular speculative industry. So maybe an idea of this is like AI. Like AI is actually not that good of a technology potentially, and we've invested billions, if not trillions, of dollars in AI. It amounts to nothing. All these stocks, Nvidia stock, etc., pops, bubble, the economy collapses. So the most common answer to sustainability is the idea of decoupling. Obviously, for things like the TPRF, right, you have to answer these arguments with a card themselves, which is why sustainability is good. Again, force the winner to make more arguments, right? But in most cases, most people prefer this sort of explanation of capitalism being unsustainable. But I think that these arguments are actually pretty good. So the most common answer to that particular argument is decoupling, which is the idea that we're decoupling or moving away from fossil fuels now. So like the market can decouple or separate itself from the investments in fossil fuels. Unfortunately, that's probably not happening because our continuous growth relies upon resource use, as I talked about with stranded assets, for example. Um, and lots of decoupling is actually not maybe happening. Maybe it's shifting the harm to other countries, right? So like maybe the US is decoupling, but maybe industries might be actually moving away, or maybe that other countries are actually growing and reaching a point where now their industry is emerging, but it's also premised upon fossil fuels. And that still causes global warming, which is bad. I've teams only read a certain number of decoupling authors, so Smith, McAfee, etc. And because socialists write so much, you can honestly have like in-depth ad hominem attacks to all these authors. Not maybe ad hominem, maybe say their sites or whatever, their studies are dumb or whatever. I don't know. Noah Smith, you can ad hom that guy for sure. He just tweeted that Chicago is a bad city. Actually, he's also just not a good guy. Portion 3 is framework. So as I mentioned in episode, I think it's 2, not 3. Framework is quite important for the CapK, as NK in general. So you have to win 2 concepts on framework. First is that critiquing the logic or ideology of capitalism is valid grounds for contesting the YC, as I said earlier. And secondly, that this contestation means they shouldn't get a permutation. So my understanding and my interpretation of the best version of CapK treats framework and the permutation in sort of a similar fashion, right? So is to say that if you win framework, then you get no permutation. And if you lose framework, then they don't get a permutation. So if the 1ER extends the permutation with a decent amount of time, then you should be extending your offensive version of framework. And if the 1ER is extending framework no Ks, remember that you need to be flowing like what version of framework the app is saying. Then you can be a little bit more defensive on framework. Um, but yes, because if they say just purely framework no Ks, then that's a whole different sort of thing. But I think the more threatening version, honestly, is the version of framework that enables a permutation, as I talked extensively about in episode 2. So if you're confused about framework, etc., I would highly recommend you watch that video. So as with any negative position, right, because this is the most threatening part of the 2AC, it demands a somewhat lengthy response. I would say definitely at least a minute, probably 120-ish. If you're slow, maybe 145. But this is like very important. And again, it's sort of dependent on what the 2AC says on the CapK. Because the CapK is very like modular and able to be fit into a wide variety of 1NCs, you might have like a 8-off strategy, and the 2AC can only say like one decoupling card, one alt fails card in the 2AC. That's their only like answer to the CapK and framework, right? In that case, yeah, just unleash the box on framework. I would have a long and short version of framework. That makes a variety of arguments, has a lot of cards on it for the long version. Just an idea, right? Because that's basically their only win condition. So I think the best interpretation for the negative is this. They get the affirmative, they get to leverage the hypothetical benefits of the affirmative, but they don't get a permutation. So you should not say this verbatim because it's like, sounds a little cheaty, to be honest, right? So you should have an offer, a counter interpretation that makes this argument without sounding like it does. So One version of this is counterterp, weigh the AF against weigh the AF against links to the plan's philosophical investments in capitalism and solvent alternative. So what does this actually mean? This should say AF, not AFs, if you're trying to copy and paste this. Philosophical investment is to say that the AF invests in capitalism as an ideological system that can solve impacts and is desirable. The 1AC did not say the AF did not say inherency, capitalism alone now. The AF solves capitalism, capitalism's good. That's not what the AF said. The AF invests and understands capitalism as innately desirable, that it can solve impacts. And the negative gets to disprove that version. The negative does not only get to disprove inherency, solvency, impact, right? The negative gets to disprove the desirability of that investment in capitalism. That's what you're expanding. And that's because the 1AC was a philosophical investment in capitalism. The permutation severs that philosophical investment because it agrees with the alternative that philosophically investing in capitalism is bad. So the permutation then severs if you win this interpretation framework. So that's the combination of framework permutation you should say. Philosophical investments, no severance. Let's think about reasons why this framework is actually justified. First is argumentative responsibility. This is a common argument in basically every K. If the 1AC is capitalist, then the team should be able to defend capitalism, right? Lazy research is bad. You should defend parts of the 1AC. That seems pretty defensible. Second is education, right? Debate's a unique site of education. In high school, you don't talk about ideology or capitalism much, right? And when you do, it's often like a microeconomics class that assumes it's good. Maybe you're in a history class that also assumes the sort of American view of history is good and naturally desirable, right? So we should have a space in debate that we invest a lot of time in and do so much research in that we can contest the validity of capitalism because debate's a unique site for education. I think this argument's actually like decently compelling, especially in high school, right? Like in college, you can take whatever class you want, but in high school, it's a very formative political process. And, if we're unable to talk about capitalism in debate, then we're like actually not learning a lot about capitalism. I mean, me personally, right? Like the Cap K occurred to me, like it appeared to me in a debate round. And that process, whatever, 6 years ago it was, that eventually caused me to start researching capitalism, understand it more, have some criticisms of capitalism, maybe understand its pros and cons. So I think that this argument's actually not like crazy to say. Third is an epistemology argument. So epistemology, again, the study of knowledge, how we know what we know. Capitalism is popular because it is sort of unreflexively viewed as true, right? So as I mentioned, the capitalism relies upon this sort of pessimistic conception of society, people interacting in society, and that pessimistic account of humanity is unreflexively seen as natural and true. Like if you were to ask anyone in your class, humans good, bad, naturally, I would say about 70% will probably say they're bad, and most of them don't come to that conclusion just via rigorous logical analysis and psychology and sociology, right? No, they're coming from it because the market, the system, the world in which we live in has compelled them to believe that position, right? So if the 1AC equally relies upon that narrative by using the market or by assuming that capitalism can solve all of our ills and that it's a desirable system, then being able to criticize the logic of capitalism on those grounds is a unique way in which we can either further or not further anti-capitalist education and be able to potentially create alternatives to capitalism in not necessarily in debate, but maybe outside of debate, etc. Right? It's a very iterative process. Fourth is that cap K is better than politics process. You get the cap good stuff, cap good 2AR, we get cap bad 2NR. Hey, that sounds like a fair debate to me. 5 is defense. So, the cap case fair. Once again, you invested in capitalism, so go ahead, defend it. Stop being a coward, right? Second is there's no ground lost because capitalism is obviously very controversial. This argument's obviously true, right? Like tons of people say capitalism's good, so saying there's no ground to contest capitalism is obviously incorrect. Third is that Cap K is obviously also predictable, right? It's the most popular argument in the past decade. 6, neg flex, obviously, lol. More things to say for the negative is always, unreflexively good. So says the 2n. And you're going to put that in your framework. You're going to say, we need more things to say on this topic. And the cap K is one of those things we got to say, and we got to make it strong. Finally, our understanding of ideological process and fiating an alternative is reciprocal to the 1AC, because the 1AC also invests in utopianism. It also invests in the idea that we can change the state in a way that's obviously not going to happen, right? If the 1AC says adopt a carbon tax, I can think of like 20 different reasons why carbon tax is not going to be implemented right now, for example. So it's a reciprocal process. And all of these arguments are also reasons in answering the permutation. So you can spend less time answering the permutation proper, because the permutation proper is framework, right? It's reasons why they should not get a permutation. So that leads me nicely into portion 3A, which is the permutation, right? Most 2NRs against the permutation will be contingent upon framework, which is why you should think of the two as very connected. So I think you should rely mostly on framework in answering the permutation. However, there are some additional arguments against you both. I didn't finish the list. I have the list in my head. First is that if the alternative abolishes the topic, like I said, then it's obviously mutually exclusive. Second is the more technical process orientation of do both, that says that do both severs some words in the resolution, like should, right? Because maybe should indicates permanency, maybe substantially severs permanency, right? So if the alternative changes the market of the 1AC, right, it renders it impermanent. So maybe it doesn't compete on those grounds. Also, you could say that you can't mix the economy, right? You cannot have a mixed socialist capitalist economy, right? Because they rely upon differing notions of who is entitled to own property, right? Like a mixed economy is just a capitalist economy. An economy that's like some things should be private, some should be public. That's how capitalism works today, right? Like, so socialism is an alternative view of the market itself. It relies upon completely different conceptions that you cannot mix. You cannot do both, right? All right, here's some typical app responses to framework. The two biggest ones. First is that debate doesn't matter that much for political subjectivity. First is like, you say, hey, yeah, it does, obviously. We spend dozens of hours here, and stop being unreflexive. Like, framework, the cap K obviously does compel people to think more about capitalism. I think that's just kind of true. The degree in which that changing of thinking actually matters for political awareness and like maybe helping people in the real world, probably less so. But again, doesn't necessarily matter, as I'll get into in a second. Because second, even if voting neg does not solve anything, it's a silly way of orienting what you should do as an educator, as a judge, right? Nothing we do in debate changes much of anything. Voting AF doesn't change much. Nothing I do as a particular person is going to change the outcome of an election, for example. But we engage in politics in sort of a group sort of way, right? Like, we have sort of views of what we think society should look like, and then we debate and talk about that as groups, as numbers, and that's why we vote in elections, even though one vote does not change the outcome of the election, right? Because it's a process of, I think this election matters. I think other people should think this election matters, so I'm going to vote, right? And this sort of adopts a deontological view of politics. Deontology is the opposite of utilitarianism. So utilitarianism argues it's an ethical framework. So these are competing ethical frameworks about what we should do. Utilitarianism says that we should maximize utility. Deontology says that we should have other sorts of moral side constraints. So for the purposes of this argument, you don't even have to describe it as deontology. You can just say that if you're complicit in a system of violence, i.e. capitalism, by voting affirmative, then that should be a reason alone why you should vote negative, right? Because even if your complicity doesn't actually make capitalism more or less violent in the actual material world, it is bad to endorse bad ideas, right? Like, it is not always rational to purely emphasize utility in politics and education, like debate, right? So that's one way in which you can approach the alt causes sort of presumption arguments on the CapK. And again, obviously having cards that demonstrate sort of the epistemological utility and value of thinking about the K in this light is also obviously a good idea. Um, Second after response is permutations are desirable, the perm double bind. I talked extensively about the perm double bind in episode whatever on framework. I think it would be episode 2 after framework. So the permutation double bind says that the alternative is large, or it's not large. So the alternative either overcomes the issues with the status quo and the plan. The plan's a very small part of the status quo. Uses the markets. Markets are non-unique, etc. Or it doesn't solve the AF and it can't solve the issue with the status quo. So that's a perm double bind, and I talk about that extensively in episode 2. You have to say that permutation, the desirability of permutations and the desirability of conceptualizing debate in terms of the perm double bind is wrong. Permutations and debates about structures and ideologies become magic wands, obviously, because like we could never posit an alternative that is actually materially exclusive with a plan and on just purely the level of like material practice, right? Like the permutation double bind is basically true, which is the reason why we should have debates over ideology, because evaluating these proposals on level of structure is good if we win framework. It's good if we can think about epistemology. It's good if we can challenge unreflexive notions of capitalism. And it's good if we can be more educated on anti-capitalism grounds, right? All those things are good. Only evaluating exclusivity solely on the basis of, well, obviously these things could probably be combined in like a hypothetical world. Well, that doesn't matter, right? What matters is that you have invested in an ideological system that trains us to think a particular way. So it would be silly then to endorse the idea that we can both endorse the market as part of the 1AC and also understand that markets are bad, right? And capitalism's bad. It's a bad form of education. It doesn't teach us anything. It's a very trivial observation that doesn't allow us to think about the ideologies present in the plan or in debate. Second is that our interpretation is not just no permutations, right? It's that if we win a link, you don't get a permutation, but if you win no link, then obviously you get a permutation, right? Then you're not forwarding a capitalist ideology. You can say the app is anti-capitalist, right? For example, and then we can have that link debate. But if you are at least slightly capitalist, then yeah, you should defend that investment. All right, portion number 4 is the link. Of course, you'll have to win one. And perhaps one of the best benefits, again, I think this actually might be the best benefit of the CapK, is that demonstrating links to particular affirmatives is pretty easy. Especially on capitalist sorts of topics like IPR or the clean energy policy topic in high school, or in college rather. And as I've sort of seen, like most of the topics I debated on from 2017 to 2023 in high school, lots of those topics became CapK or Econ DA topics for 2Ns. And because lots of them at least require some usage of the market, right? Like when people are making topics, they're usually thinking at least somewhat about the CapK and how to make links for it, because the CapK is such a prominent argument. And most topics do have very good links. And obviously that's topic dependent. Obviously, I hope someone's watching this in like 2037 and that's a whole different topic, and I can't predict what's going to happen there. But, if you understand what capitalism is, what the critiques are of particular types of proposals, if you read all the stuff, if you watch all the stuff I presented to you earlier, then yeah, you can go on jacobin.com. You can Google what the app is, carbon capture storage, whatever it is, and then you'll probably have a link, and you'll probably know how to make a link. Which is why, as I said, the K requires some knowledge about capitalism, which is why I tried to demonstrate some help people understand some of the basic premises of capitalism for a while. So here are some genres of link, right? The easy ones, the topic specific ones, right? So you could use the market, you use the IPR, you use the econ growth, all those. You think that they are good, and we think that they are bad and premised upon capitalism. That this should be quite intuitive, right? Like if you win that IPR is capitalist, then obviously the AF uses IPR, then it's capitalist. Second are Marxist critiques of international relations and capitalist imperialism. So I've demonstrated how Marxists are very aware of like the issues of U.S. hegemony, for example. So if you can go on Jacobin, etc., you can have critiques of U.S. hegemony or specific types of proposals. Maybe competing with China is a proposal that will probably be a very popular genre proposal on a particular topic. Obviously, the links there are very quite strong. The U.S. We think that China is bad because their like government's really bad, but in reality, it's actually motivated by a material interest. It's actually motivated in trying to find resources, compete for those resources, define the terms of like the World Trade Organization, all that sort of stuff. That's actually what's happening, not national competition. Um, Third is like obviously specific link arguments. The good thing about the CAPK is that you can probably find a specific link to any affirmative in 30 minutes before the round, especially the couple weeks before the tournament, right? With the affirmatives you're most worried about. So it literally takes like an hour to have like an app-specific link card, an app-specific impact card, not impact card, app-specific alternative card, app-specific link turns case card. That's 2 cards, 20 minutes per card. That's very easy to find on places like Jacobin. Fourth is you can obviously have very generic links, but obviously don't rely upon these too much. Obviously prefer the specific case, specific types of topics, or specific types of affirmatives. And you'll kind of know the genres of affirmatives as the topic evolves, and you should have critiques of all those sort of genres. All right. In most cases, demonstrating a link is actually pretty straightforward with the CAPK. So I would spend less time on the link for the CAPK itself, like demonstrating the link, than something like the security K. So you should think about 2 main things when you're making the link, right? First, is my link specific enough? So even if you don't have a card that says that, you know, um, the app specific proposal is bad, you can obviously use your topic generic card to extrapolate arguments against the plan. If you have a decent understanding of capitalism and like the issues with capitalism and the issues with the topic, then apply those issues of the topic to the plan, right? And like most of the time, this is specific enough for almost every judge to be like, wow, these kids, they know that what they're talking about. They know the critiques of capitalism. They know that the markets always don't allocate things. They know the idea of externalities, etc. So that's sort of the approach that you should be taking. Second is my link offensive enough, right? So remember how I talked about turns case. Most judges will kind of give you the link, at least a defensive version of the link, enough to win framework, right? And then impact. So you should think about implicating the link for general solvency of the 1AC, right? So this means that you should spend less time on the case page in the 2NC because you have defense of the case while making link turns case arguments. Here's an example of a card I cut against the CCS AF on the college topic as a CapK link. Some things to note. First is environmentalist, LOL. Socialists write a lot, and some of them are not qualified. Whatever. Qualifications are like bourgeois, whatever. That's what you can say. Little Jack Young tip of the day. You can see here that this is app specific. Obviously, it has specific impacts, right? So these are turns case arguments. Carbon capture is used to silence critics and stay in business. So it like allows fossil fuel industries to stay in business. It's also used in enhanced oil recovery, which is fracking, which accelerates carbon extraction, turns case. And this is contingent upon the industry, right? They take public investment money, do nothing, billions of subsidies, and they capture less than 1% of their emissions. And under the logic of capitalism, corporations actually have zero incentive to develop carbon capture because the issue is that the externality is not the externality does not matter for the corporation, right? The reason an externality is an externality is because the corporation doesn't have to care because they just want to maximize profit. So if you're maximizing profit, then you're never going to have the CCS technology because you don't care about warming, and developing CCS costs money, right? So they only develop CCS just enough to act like they're doing something, but not actually do anything at all. And so we can only sufficiently use CCS technology if we decouple it from the industry and build it within the public sector, far from the tyranny of the profit margin. So again, that's your alt solves, that's your socialist CCS solves, capitalist CCS bad, social CCS solves. And this is the logic of how you should be approaching link arguments. Like this is the best version of a link argument, right? Because it has specific impacts that you can extrapolate in the 2 and C, specific turns case arguments, and it has like an alternative solves argument, right? And as you can see here, is cut from Jacobin, right? Because Jacobin, I would say, is the best way of finding link arguments. And it's honestly very easy for link turns case argument just to like say that, industries are bad. The private people that own our lives are all idiots that don't understand what's going on, all that sort of stuff. That's actually pretty intuitive for most judges, and it's like probably true. So like, you can just impact turn that logic, say that that implicates case under a particular fashion, and that's probably sufficient. But again, be as specific as possible, right? Like, if you take away anything from this section, it's that links obviously should be as specific as possible, and relying upon blocks only is not sufficient. Okay. Portion 5, the alternative. So using my version of framework, right? They don't get a permutation, and obviously you should conceptualize like the bigger the alternative, right? Like the more chance the alt actually solves things. Why is my pen not working? Oh my god. The more chance that the alt solves things, the more chance that um the permutation solves, right? Because of the perm double bind. So if you went on framework that the permutation they don't get one, AF doesn't even get a permutation, then okay, the alternative can now become quite large and solid. So if you explain it as just a socialist revolution or abolish the topic, that's fine. That's the most common way of explaining it. And you can use fiat, right? If the negatives ask, do you use fiat? Obviously, in cross-six, never answer their questions in cross-six about the cap K alt, right? Be as obfuscating as possible. No, we alternatively imagine society. We imagine society outside the ideological confines of the 1AC. And if you win framework, then that's a valid grounds of contestation, and that's fine, right? And the good thing about imagination is you can imagine lots of good ideas, right? You can imagine a socialism that solves lots of issues with the status quo. So this is why I think my version of framework is good, right? It's the most strategic version because it allows the alternative to escape some of the actual reasons why a socialist revolution would fail. It's not popular. It gets cracked down because you're winning a framework. You're using framework to no link most of the arguments against the alternative. So I have some examples here. First is like the crackdown argument, which says that the military will just shoot all the socialists. No link. We're alternative competing imaginary. I'm imagining a socialist revolution right now. Look at the power of my brain. Oh my god, it's thinking so much that the government's not going to do that. Maybe we get the military on board. Maybe something like that. Maybe they just maybe they realize the class consciousness. Maybe they're like, actually, the government I'm serving is bad. I'm going to flip to the social side. I don't know. There are lots of things, but competing imaginaries, you're also using imaginary and ideological imaginary, so it's reciprocal. Answer number 2, socialism impossible. No link. We get a thing called fiat. You also use that. The F's also impossible, so this can't be an argument against us because we got neg fiat. Second is that it is possible. The only reason that you think that maybe like socialism can't work or that people are too self-interested is that capitalism has told you that people are too self-interested, and there's lots of cards that sort of demonstrate this epistemic sort of argument that you can use. Third is like maybe populist overcome or maybe populist gain power because of socialism. Again, no link, competing imaginaries, all the bad guys get out, all the good guys get in. Obviously, before the 1NC, you should be prepared to answer certain questions about the alternative. Does it fiat? What's fiat? And then like, what? You said what's fiat? And then, yeah, I don't know what fiat is. What do you mean by fiat? And then they have to go back to their novice notes and be like, what's fiat? What am I supposed to explain? This gets people all the time. I can't believe it. Second is, and then they'll figure it out, and you'll be like, competing imaginaries, etc. Second is how many people get involved in the revolution, what types of people. Sort of vaguely say, decent amount, a lot of people, but don't say a lot. Just say, about sufficient to imagine a socialist society that's competitive with the affirmative. There you go. That's what I would say. Is it international? I don't know. It can be international, yes, no, up to you. Does it use the military? Yes, no, it can be up to you. Probably yes, international. Probably yes, military. We're gonna win framework anyways, so who cares? And in any case, the bigger the alternative, obviously the better at solving, but the less likely it competes. So everything with the cap has this sort of trade-off, and you have to sort of bite off one side of the trade-off. And what I've done is bite off the less likely competes part by introducing framework as my answer to the less likely competes part. So hopefully that makes sense, right? Less likely competes means more likely the permutation, but because we're denying the permutation, they don't get it. All right, finally, theory. Um, AF teams might read theory. Lots of the times they do. So I'm not going to go over every theory argument. They're all kind of silly, in my opinion. First is that our framework demonstrates how these three arguments are anti-educational and limit exploring ideology. If the argument is like, vague utopian alts are bad, well, it's like vague utopian alts are good. We should learn about utopian features of socialism. We should imagine hypothetical imaginaries that contest our vision of capitalism, for example. Second is that theory itself as an argument is bad, right? It's arbitrary, it's unpredictable. No one knows what vague or utopian or private actor means. No one can truly predict it. If they say private actor fiat, then you're like, what the heck? Reciprocal. Hello, use private actor. You use utopian. The plan's probably vague because you don't want us to write picks to your app. So like, what are we talking about? Go back to the drawing board. How about you say framework permutation instead of theory next time? And third is that if the app was truly that abusive, right? If the app's alternative was truly so large, then surely you could read a permutation, not a theory argument that solves your offense. Um, if like alternative was super abusive, hey, you get the permutation to say, hey, well, they're doing so much stuff. Obviously, the app can be compatible with this. The obvious secret is that you don't really get a permutation under a logic of framework, right? But and then obviously you're like neg flex, etc. All the silly little arguments against theory and things that you apply on every negative position ever. Okay. This was a pretty long. Hopefully, it was generally explanatory. I try to go through lots of different things, lots of different ways. Approaching this topic is a little bit hard from the perspective of the lecturer because like it's such a big issue. What do I even like talk about? What is the CapK? So hopefully this was helpful to at least some people. Maybe you got some ideas for the CapK that you can use in future debates. Jack Young, Policy Debate Central, forever.